So good morning everybody and welcome to this Security Day on creating fragmentation and polarization and recreating a climate for stability in Europe. Easier said than done, of course. But the OSCE is a platform for dialogue, is a platform for engagement, so this is also the spirit of this Security Day, to create an environment when we can look at the issues on the agenda in an informal manner, have a debate among ourselves and explore the way forward. This is also a follow-up to a Security Day we had in Berlin last year, so it's becoming part of a process in itself. The Security Days, as you know, are an informal environment for continuing the discussion that we have more formally in the bodies of the organization. It's not entirely off the record because we have cameras, we are online, and there are tweets coming in from the outside to interact with the speakers. So I would like to thank you, to thank the speakers, the moderators for being here today. I would like to thank in particular the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for co-organizing and co-sponsoring this event. And I would like also to thank our own colleagues, beginning from Ian Plessinger and the OSCE Documentation Center in Prague, and then the policy team and the communication media relation team of the Secretariat. I would like to say a few words about the rationale behind this Security Day. So the idea is to contribute to a dialogue on how to create a stable and resilient security environment in Europe at a time of global uncertainty and unpredictability unprecedented for decades. Norms and principles underpinning international order have been challenged, multilateralism seems to be in retreat, key institutions being questioned at the risk of being weakened. A result could be a more fragmented and polarized multipolar world. But despite mutual divisions and differences, current challenges to European as well as global security require cooperation, and OSCE participating states should seek a convergence of interest whenever possible. While growing uncertainty and fragmentation make these efforts increasingly difficult, the only way to move forward is by continuing to find areas for engagement. At the OSCE ministerial meeting in Hamburg in December last year, OSCE participating states launched a process of structured dialogue on current and future challenges and risks to security in the OSCE area that should serve as a basis for the way forward. And today's event is expected also to contribute to these discussions by generating concrete ideas and recommendations for countering increasing fragmentation and polarization to the security environment in Europe, returning to constructive dialogue and pragmatic cooperation, and strengthening trust and confidence among OSCE participating states. So we will have a number of sessions. You'll see it from the program. I won't spend time to explain how the meeting is structured. In the concluding session, I will try also to draw some concrete conclusions for the way forward for us. So I'll try to take an operational approach to that final discussion. And as I said, the event is streamed live on OSCE website. I would like to encourage active participation on social media, hashtag SecDays on Twitter, and feel free to use Twitter very actively also to interact with us. As usual, there will be a summary report of key findings from the discussion that will be drafting for circulation to OSCE participating states. So thank you again for participating. Thanks to the speakers and the moderators. I would like to pass the floor to Štefan Füle, who is the Special Envoy for the OSCE and the Western Balkans of the Czech Republic. Štefan.
Very good morning, Deputy Prime Minister, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today in Prague to the OSCE Security Days. I'm very glad that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic has been given the opportunity and the privilege to host such an important event. Lamberto, you know about our support for your concept of informal discussion on important and topical issues. Let me thank you, dear Secretary General, your able colleagues, the Prague office of the OSCE Secretariat, and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for excellent cooperation to put this event together. Dear colleagues, allow me just a short excursion to the history to sketch briefly the role of my capital in the history of the OSCE. The Helsinki Final Act was in fact a key factor in mobilizing the civic opposition to the communist regime. The petition, Charter 77, was drafted as a consequence of Czechoslovakia's ratification of Helsinki Final Act in 1976. Later on, as support for, at that time, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe was an integral part of the new Czechoslovak foreign policy after the Velvet Revolution. I'm not sure whether you have noticed a small plaque while taking the stairs to enter this hall. It says, and I quote, "In a big hall of the Chernian Palace, on July 1st, 1991, the protocol on terminating the Warsaw Pact was signed by Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Soviet Union, and at that time, Czechoslovakia. That was the end of the Soviet bloc." End of quote. So it was therefore very logical, I would say, that the city of Prague became the seat of the newly established Secretariat of the CSCE in 1991. In 1994, the conference changed its status and became the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And the Secretariat moved to a larger Vienna-based organizational structure. And because of its transition, the Prague office, or the Prague Documentation Center, as it is called currently, kept two of its initial functions. It remained the CSCE/OSCE Historical Archives repository and continued to disseminate public information. And since 1993, Prague has been hosting the Economic and Environmental Forum, which is the main annual event in the OSCE economic and environmental dimension. Dear colleagues, the current security status quo is unattainable. Status quo does not mean that the ground on which we all stand is not moving. On the contrary, it brings less and less trust, more tension, more populism, more erosion of democratic institutions and principles. Step by step, it undermines our common values. Price of not acting on current security challenges will be charged against our credit cards. Not now, later, and with an interest. The OSCE is a unique pan-European regional security organization. Any other regional or sub-regional organizations might become a victim of self-illusion that it alone could tackle the security challenges on the basis of its own perceptions. Consequently, all of us in the OSCE, we have a unique responsibility. Responsibility to tell our capitals, our politicians, our leaders, that unless we have sincere dialogue and common action, Europe will not be united, will not be peaceful and prosperous continent, and people will be moved from their homes and will be eventually killed. Responsibility to turn the consensus from the instrument of veto into an instrument of searching for compromise, ensuring a mutual beneficial solution, respecting each other's interests through adhering to basic OSCE commitments. Dear colleagues, let me express my belief that despite of all contradictions, all OSCE participating states will be able to agree on one essential prerequisite for a positive development, and that is the continuation of an open and inclusive dialogue on security issues. And today's platform of Security Days may serve this goal. In 1991, in this very hall, we rejected the past which had been dividing us. Let us today, in the same room, strive for the common understanding and a common approach for the sake of our stable and peaceful future. Many thanks and welcome to Prague.
Dear Deputy Prime Minister, dear Ambassador Füle, dear Lamberto, dear Dr. Krumm, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a special pleasure to represent the Austrian chairmanship at these Security Days. I would like to thank the Secretary General, together with the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, for hosting this event, and I do not want to let this occasion pass without congratulating Secretary General Lamberto Zannier and his team for organizing so many interesting and successful security days these last years. I especially thank to you for this. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing turbulent times in the OSCE area and beyond. Geopolitical tensions are on the rise, and so are new threats, such as cyber incidents or hybrid warfare. At the same time, traditional security challenges persist, including open and protracted conflicts within the OSCE area and in our neighborhood. As a chair, we have placed rebuilding trust in the OSCE between partners at the core of our agenda, starting with an effort to defuse conflicts such as the one in and around Ukraine that has only recently caused such a tragic loss for the OSCE. Also, building on the ministerial declaration from Lisbon to Hamburg, we have relaunched a meaningful security dialogue among all. In fact, the successful start of the so-called structured dialogue on current and future challenges and risks to security in the OSCE area inspires us with hope. This dialogue has counted on high-ranking and high-quality participation of partners and already created a real momentum for finding new and refinding lost common ground. We hope that today's meeting can be another step to relaunch the OSCE as the space for security dialogue in Europe, and I hope to take back with me numerous fresh ideas from our discussions here to Vienna. Thank you very much.
Dear Prime Minister, dear Ministers, dear Gernot Erler, dear Mr. Füle, dear Secretary General Zannier, dear guests, dear friends, it's an honor for the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung to be part of the OSCE Security Days. We have started this partnership last year in Berlin, when Germany had the chairmanship of the OSCE, and we thought this is a good idea to continue this. I'm here at the capacity of the head of the new regional office of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung of Cooperation and Peace in Europe, and as you can understand from the title of this, we are very close to the OSCE because we think this is a good chance to use this organization to have its own initiative on security and cooperation in Europe. Because usually the comparison today is we have a second Cold World War, there are books out on that, but there is a major difference between the Cold War and the situation today. And the difference is that we don't have two blocks anymore. We have more countries, independent, sovereign, and being part of the process of having the wish to be independent and sovereign and being secure. This is new. So our office, as much as the OSCE, of course our office in a much smaller capacity, is trying to have this regional approach, a European regional approach. That was what the OSCE was found on, the KSCE Final Act. Mr. Füle talked about this, and we would like to continue this again in our capacity. Willy Brandt, the former German chancellor, once said that foreign policy is much too important just to leave it to state institutions. And the Ebert Foundation, as an NGO, is trying to work on that too. The stable security environment we had in mind in 1990, the Paris Charter, an undivided security in Europe, we don't have this at the moment, and I think we have to come back to that, no doubt, especially because of the smaller countries which partly feel insecure. What we have today, and this is the final small thought, is that the United States and Europe looking towards Russia and expecting Russia doing things they shouldn't do. Russia is looking at the EU and is thinking they are doing things they shouldn't do. And to both opinions, there is less or more, something is on that. I think the core, what we should look for and what the OSCE is capable of, and the Ebert-Stiftung in its small capacity too, is a very important ingredient for the understanding, which is transparency of intention. If we have this transparency of intention on both sides, I think this would be a huge and major step towards trust, and as you all know, trust would be the ingredient to come to something. Thank you very much, and before I leave this podium, I would like to introduce the Deputy Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, who will have the introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome in Prague. Are we willing to make sacrifice for our values? To begin with, I will ask the rhetorical question: are we willing to make sacrifices for our values? It is quite deliberately that I have chosen such a provocative title for my contribution, because we have today in the European Union what we wished for: freedom, prosperity, peace. We are incomparably better off than those who came before us. But I'm afraid there is something quite important missing in contrast: a clear commitment to our values and roots, and a willingness to commit to personal sacrifice for them. Our current MEP, Pavel Svoboda, told us a few years ago from talks with the then Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. He told the delegation he was a Muslim from a secular state, but willing to die for Islam. And then he asked what the Europeans were willing to die for, which was followed by a silence as if from the grave. When we speak today about security threats, then perhaps the worst of them does not come from outside, but is hidden inside us. Its name is a lack of the will to defend. In saying this, I do not mean to downplay threats such as terrorism, migration, rogue states, or international forces. But it is certainly true that challenges and risks are better handled by those who are sure of their identity, who are solid in their values and ready to defend them by all means necessary. What are our values? And are we willing to die for them too? That is indeed the question. Our first president, T.G. Masaryk, said that a person can endure much if he has a goal, and also that states are sustained by the ideals on which they were established. Western civilization was born of Christian ethics from the ancient tradition of critical thinking, from the principles of Roman law, except that we are afraid to subscribe to our Judeo-Christian roots even in the basic documents of the European Union. Critical thinking has taken fright and the popularity of conspirations and fake news is growing. And often people do not feel that they can claim their rights. The complicated legal jungle has become obscure for them. No, I don't want to say that we have lost our values and ideas. But it is true that they have been somewhat undermined and that our European identity is weakening. Recently, many self-styled defenders of European or national culture have emerged. But how many of them actually profess Western values? How many of them are willing to die for them? Yes, a person will endure much if he has a goal. But what is this goal? That goal cannot merely be the passive effort not to let foreigners in. Only those who are actively self-assured of their roots and of their identity do not have to be concerned for the survival of their culture. On the contrary, however weakness his own values is condemned to submit to outside pressure. The backbone of the West consists of two institutions, NATO and the European Union, on which the transatlantic partnership is built. Our future is directly dependent on how strong this transatlantic institution will be. And that future, I mean quite literally the survival of our civilization, or at the very last is survival in form we know. Again, I do not want to say that NATO and the EU are fated to end, but there are alarming signals here and have been for some time. It is no secret that most European countries, including the Czech Republic, do not meet even the minimum NATO requirements to spend 2% of GDP of defense. My party, the Christian Democrats, is trying to change that. We have advocated an increase in defense spending, and we insist on reaching the 2% threshold by 2023 at the latest. Nevertheless, resistance to this is great. As far as the European Union is concerned, it suffers from an institutional sclerosis, too much bureaucracy, decision-making, which is uncharacteristically distant from its citizens, too many words and not enough that people understand. But meanwhile, the EU failed its core functions. It is a space for freedom, security and prosperity, as its founders laid down. It remains true that the European Union is the world's largest marketplace. NATO is the most successful defense alliance in history, and strong partnership brings the USA to Europe. For this to remain so in the future, we must strengthen the awareness of the identity of Western civilization, improve our defense capability, and defeat the old-fashioned bugger of protectionism. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that we have a lot of goals, but we must be far more capable in enforcing peace and stability, while respecting international law more than in the past and taking on only those tasks and missions that we can really manage, by which is meant not to only winning on the battlefield, but also ensuring lasting stability. The prerequisite for this is that we will stop trying to export democracy and Western culture, but we set more sober goals for ourselves. A non-violent form of government and guarantee of basic human rights and the possibility of economic developments. This is how I see a problem-solving approach applied by a confident and at the same time emphatic culture. It is right that the strong try to help the weak. Indeed, pragmatically, we are defending ourselves by staying off potential threats while they are still far from our borders. Today's world is no intercontinental that no conflict is so distant that it cannot affect us. 30 years since the fall of the Iron Curtain, the world is again a dangerous place, in a way perhaps even more than at the time of the existence of two blocks. If we are to stabilize it successfully, we need to start with ourselves. So let us ask, what are we willing to sacrifice for our values? Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear friends, Secretary General. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of the first panel, first session, which will be discussing the state of European security today and prospects for the future. My name is Marcel Petiot. I am director of the Conflict Prevention Center, which is part of the OSCE Secretariat in Vienna. And we are providing the operational support to our field operations, as well as advice and support to the Secretary General, Chairmanship in Office, Troika, other participating states. And I can tell you that the state of European security is not very rosy today. To conduct our business in current environment is extremely challenging. And I think that if we have differences on many issues, there is at least one issue where we have consensus, that the European security is in deep crisis. Where we don't have a consensus, though, was how we got there, what went wrong, why we have different security perceptions, what happened between the signing of the Paris Charter and today, whether we can repair this, whether we can re-engage, whether we can revitalize the notion of cooperative security, which lies as a backbone of the OSCE, or whether we need yet another big war to come to the senses and try to get together and find a way out. Well, I was also spending some time in this room in the beginning of 90s, where there were meetings of committee of senior officials of then the CSCE. Those were the regular meetings every month when political directors arrived here to discuss issues which were on the CSCE agenda. A part of the follow-up to the Paris Charter, Helsinki Summit, we had to deal with the conflicts. We had to deal with the emerging conflicts in former Yugoslavia, in former Soviet Union, and despite there were huge differences on many issues, I think we had at least a common objective to address these conflicts together, to work on the basis of the commitments and principles and values we have agreed upon. And as it was already mentioned, we believe that we are working towards Europe which is be one, undivided, which will be based in democratic principles and which will not know anymore the sphere of influences or special zones with the special rules, where we will be building our security through dialogue and cooperation. So how realistic was this hope? Can we revitalize this hope today? Do we have chance to re-engage? We have tried to do so for many times. You remember Corfu process. You remember after the war in Georgia, You remember Astana Summit Declaration, which is 2010, which is talking about the common security space or community rooted in shared values and principles. You remember Vilnius to Vienna process. You remember Helsinki plus 40. So all these were attempts to engage and address these differences in a cooperative way and try to find a common ground. However, today we have fragmented and polarized security. We have very different perceptions of security. We have belief that security has been established at the expense of each other. We have different interpretation of the enlargement of the European and Euro-Atlantic structures. If countries of Central and Eastern Europe saw this opportunity after the dissolution of Warsaw Pact and the communist bloc as an opportunity to strengthen their independence, to put themselves on the path towards democracy, prosperity, others might not have seen it like that. We have countries who are not part of any alliances or groupings, and simply we have antagonistic atmosphere in the European security, as we can see it in Vienna, as we can see it in the east of Ukraine, where we have day-to-day violations of ceasefire, where people are dying, where we are unable to find a common ground in the political process. So the situation is not rosy, as I said, and this is not a new topic. I mean, we have been discussing it for some time. We remember the efforts of Minister Steinmeier, when or today President Steinmeier, when he is in his capacity as a chair in office, really was investing a lot of efforts to reconcile these processes and put the path towards discussing the future of the arms control, for instance, to discuss these differences. And as it was said already, this resulted in the decision on having a structured dialogue, which I believe will be discussed later after this session. And I am joined in discussing with a very distinguished panel. The invitation has been accepted by Mr. Gernot Erler, who is a special representative for the OSCE at the German Federal Foreign Office. We have been working very closely throughout your chairmanship, and I remember right from the beginning of your duty how you really try to engage, and there was a lot of investment on different levels, and trying to really both address the conflicts which we have in the area and at the same time launch the new process of reconciliation. We have on the panel Ambassador Lukashevich, Alexander Lukashevich, who is currently the permanent representative of Russian Federation to the OSCE. Alexander has a very rich diplomatic career, including important position at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and today he represents Russia in the OSCE. We have also with us François Heisbourg, who, among other responsibilities, is special advisor at the La Fondation pour la Recherche, Stratégique. And we all know Mr. Heisbourg from his high-level contributions to the discourse on European security and never-ending optimism that cooperation should prevail over confrontation. And last but not least, we have Ambassador William Hill, who, a part of many diplomatic duties, also spent 2 terms as a head of mission of the OSCE mission in Moldova, trying to pursue the peace process there and process of reunification of the country. And I think, Bill, that you are one of the few who made it 2 times as a head of mission, but I remember how we were very close to really finding a common ground, and I hope that with your broad experience and knowledge, we will again try to re-engage there. So, the questions are out there. What went wrong? How do you see the main security challenges and risks in Europe? Can we do something more and differently that this risk will be reduced? How this further deterioration can be prevented? And what steps should be taken to put security in cooperation as a concept for strengthening stability and prosperity of Europe on a more stable basis? Why don't we start with Mr. Erler, who has the most fresh experience of this. From there, please.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Secretary General, dear Lamberto, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this conference comes very timely. I thank you, Secretary General Zannier, for having taken the initiative. Its title, Countering Fragmentation and Polarization, Recreating a Climate for Stability in Europe, is emblematic for the current difficult state of play when it comes to security in Europe and the whole OSCE area. When Germany took over the OSCE chairmanship last year, our motto was renewing dialogue, rebuilding trust, restoring security. At the end of 2016, we drew a mixed balance. On the positive side, we have helped strengthening the OSCE's special monitoring mission in Ukraine. We also initiated a structured dialogue on current and future challenges and risks to security in the OSCE area, and participating states decided by consensus to work on new important topics such as migration and economic connectivity. But we are still far from having restored security or having recreated stability in Europe. While the overarching aim of creating a free, democratic, common and indivisible Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security community stretching from Vancouver to Vladivostok, rooted in agreed principles, shared commitments and common goals, that was a quotation, was adopted at the OSCE's last summit in Astana 2010, OSCE participating states continue to be deeply divided in their analysis on ways and means to achieve this goal. Moreover, we observe a disturbing lack of trust between people and their governments, within societies, between states, and at the regional level. How can we improve the current state of affairs? I am deeply convinced that even in such difficult times for our security in Europe and the whole OSCE area, we should stick to a double-track approach. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea violates international law, including the Helsinki Final Act and multilateral agreements such as the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Therefore, nobody should be surprised by the fact that NATO has acted in great cohesion and taken a number of reassurances measures by increasing its presence on the eastern flank, in particular by establishing an enhanced forward presence. These measures are proportionate and purely defensive. At the same time, at NATO's most recent summit in Warsaw, allies committed to a periodic, focused, and meaningful dialogue with Russia in order to avoid unintended escalation. I truly believe that firmness on principles should go hand in hand with readiness for dialogue. Both remain two sides of the same coin. I will give you 3 examples why I think this is important. First, nobody can be interested in a new arms race. To the contrary, we should step up our efforts for a renewed dialogue on security policy issues and on conventional arms control in Europe and the OSCE area. In times of low mutual trust, it should be of mutual interest to increase predictability, trust, and transparency. Therefore, I welcome the decision by OSCE participating states to set up an informal working group on a structured dialogue to address pressing issues such as threat perceptions, military postures, and the problem of the eroding arms control architecture in Europe. The first high-level meeting of OSCE capital representatives in Vienna at the beginning of April went very well. There is good reason to continue the process with a clear focus on politico-military affairs. We are looking forward to the next meeting on June 6th and the first stock-taking of the process during the informal OSCE ministerial in Vienna on July 11th. Second, we want to strengthen multilateralism and the European rules-based order. And we want to give the OSCE the instruments it needs to play its role when the rules are broken. Our OSCE chairmanship has proven that this approach can bear fruit, and we are grateful that Austria continues to follow this path. Our efforts to strengthen the special monitoring mission in Ukraine by increasing the number of monitors and technical capabilities is only the most concrete and prominent example. However, the recent tragic incident involving a SMM patrol was a stark reminder of how fragile and risky the security situation along the line of contact is. Let me repeat once again, the ceasefire must finally be respected. Threats against the mission are unacceptable and must stop. We should give also another serious thought to strengthening the OSCE's capabilities over the entire conflict cycle. For example, by putting a small special crisis management fund at the OSCE Secretary General's disposal for rapid reaction in crisis situations. And we should continue to invest in the SMM's capabilities, such as long-range unmanned aerial vehicles. And third, it might be useful to find out more about the reasons for diverging narratives between East and West. We could do more to support historical research on the basis of archives and oral history projects. This should facilitate a more informed debate among governments and civil society. To this end, Germany will support a project by the Center for OSCE Research at the Hamburg Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy on the title, Divergent Narratives and Lessons for the OSCE Today, focusing in particular on the road towards the Charter of Paris. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't need another Helsinki process. What we need is to move back to the consensus among all OSCE participating states that the European peace order, embodied by the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris, remains the fundament and the rule book by which we play. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these clear messages. So what I'm taking from this, that there is a stress to continue dialogue while being aware that the fundamental principles of the organization and the European security have been undermined, and at the same time looking for common ground where to strengthen the predictability, transparency, and also, of course, focusing on addressing the conflict in the east of Ukraine and trying to re-energize the efforts in helping the SMM, which is currently really finding itself in very precarious and insecure situation to do their job. So plenty of challenges, Ambassador Lukashevich, and of course Russia plays a key role in many of those. So what's the reading of Moscow of current situation? How do you see the reasons for current fatigue of European security, and where is the Moscow staying of the next steps there? Alexander, please.
Thank you, Marcel. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, many thanks to our esteemed Secretary General Lamberto Zannier, who contributed personally to this OSCE Security Days to refresh our memories, to find some ways forward out of this deadlock. And of course, many thanks for our Czech hosts for organizing this exchange of views. It should be frank. I'll be trying to be thought-provoking, but my plea no generation should be dying for any values anymore. We should be fiercely fighting for our norms and principles enshrined in Helsinki finally and further. It's strange for me that nobody reminded us of the Charter for European Security and the Platform for Cooperative Security of 1999. So the history in some of the minds stopped at Paris Charter. But we've gone further in our thoughts and practical measures to alleviate the role of the OSCE as the only pan-European organization, security oriented definitely. So, of course, many security challenges right now. Stop me if I exceed my time frame, of course, definitely but there are some talking points, very provocative ones, so I should be willing to share with you. And a piece of history, modern history, of course, cures better than a lot of books read in the libraries. So we have here in the panel, I think, the gentleman and the group of politicians who represent a living history of the CEC, OSCE, and contributed personally to this organization. So the focus of my topic will be the Russian view of what happened and what should be done in terms of consolidating our norms and principles, and the role of the OSCE, definitely. But of course, any in-depth conversation on the state of European security inevitably takes us back to the times when disappearances of ideological rift between East and West has created real opportunities for constructing a common European home. Strangely enough, nobody wanted to remind us of this concept, which still exists in OSCE documents, including Astana Declaration. But we've gone further, agreeing that it should be a Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security community, which should be constructed by all participating states and beyond. So, a lot of things were said on blocks. Of course, one block disappeared, but one remained. And its behavior very questionable in terms of security guarantees for non-participants in this block. I will be talking a little bit on that. But actually, Russia made a crucial contribution to the elimination of the material legacy of the confrontation area. Our country assumed the obligation to withdraw its troops and armaments in enormous amounts from Germany, Central and Eastern Europe, and later from the Baltic countries. If requested, I will be giving you some data. Of course, my country can hardly be blamed for not reacting positively to reasonable and mutually beneficial initiatives of the Western partners. Our country repeatedly joined multilateral efforts for the sake of strengthening common security. Let me cite some examples. Russia and NATO navies have been patrolling the Mediterranean Sea under the framework of Active Endeavour operation and have been cooperating on counter-terrorism issues, jointly fight against piracy in the Aden Gulf. Russian peacekeepers participated alongside divisions from NATO member states in the operation under the United Nations Security Council mandate in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1995, 2003. And so many other examples. The recent one of secure elimination of Syrian chemical weapons on the US vessel Cape Ray, and it was a maritime mission with a crucial decision on Russia-NATO Council, but unfortunately it was suspended early 2014 after the decision of several NATO member states. The Russian Federation has participated and continues to participate in other peacekeeping operations. in different regions. Unfortunately, 1990 dividends of peace were not realized. The logic of the so-called winners of the Cold War prevailed. Russia's refusal from the Soviet politics based on imposing ideological cliché were removed, and sincere openness to cooperate have been interpreted in many Western capitals as Moscow's readiness to make further unilateral concessions. So the ideological confrontation has been replaced by committed attempts to establish a certain model of world order structured around Western or neoliberal, as you wish, approaches towards politics, economics, social relations, and so forth. So, turning back to the OSCE, multiple commitments on the indivisibility of security, which is a crucial pattern of our common and comprehensive concept of security adopted in the OSCE, also at the highest level, remained largely on paper. And nobody even tried to remind us of the core concept of the CC-OSCE. It's a common, comprehensive, indivisible security in OSCE region of responsibility. So Russian proposals to strengthen the security architecture in the Euro-Atlantic area by translating political declarations into legally binding agreements were simply silence. So the tabled European Security Treaty is still on the table. And we tried during even Corfu discussions to engage our partners for discussing the concept itself, because of course CFE Treaty is not an OSCE document, but it was elaborated and adopted under the auspices of the OSCE. An Istanbul document, if you read it carefully, the treaty itself is a part of this document, despite the fact that it is not a purely OSCE document. So we can do more in terms of strengthening our commitments. So vital to remind that these proposals guarantee equal rights to all European states, including neutral. Most probably that if accepted as a ground for comprehensive agreement, then it could have prevented the current crisis in Ukraine even. So I deliberately devote so many attention to NATO, for example, and the posture of this alliance. By the way, the recent seminar on military doctrines, our representative showed a clear picture that NATO has now in 3 or 4 times excessive military potential, rather than blaming Russia that we are concentrating our troops. So 3 or 4 times. I have the concrete figure based on the Vienna Document Exchange Information Web. So if you wish, I will try to prove it. But look, the concept of this bloc is to deter Russia, which is not compatible with the OSCE principles and commitments. Strangely enough, the same countries participating in the NATO adopt quite an opposite view and quite opposite decisions when it comes to the OSCE. We had a comparative analysis of the Warsaw, for example, decisions of NATO and how it cannot be compared with the same principles and commitments taken within the OSCE, CC-OSCE. And you look, it's quite an opposite view. If you wish, you can try it through our website. It is also translated into English. Simply a mathematical comparison, what NATO is doing and what the OSCE should be doing. So it's quite an interesting document for reading. So what's next? What's next? There is no comprehensive recipe, definitely. If you wish me to give you a recipe, or to give all of us a recipe what to do next, with dialogues, with structured, whether it's structured or not, it should be a willing, how to say, to back to the egg, get back to our commitments and obligations to structure Europe and Euro-Atlantic and Eurasia in such a way that no warfares, no contamination, no aggression, aggressive posture or actions can be given to participating states. So if we are engaged in this particular framework, which was designed exactly for not being provocative in warfares, we simply should strictly follow our guidelines and implement what had been reached. For generations strived for this framework, for the OSCE to exist as the only pan-European cooperative framework. So if we would wish to see the fragmentation and polarization, as it call it, it's not the case for the OSCE. OSCE was designed exactly for maintaining peace, stability, and cooperative security in Eurasia, Euro-Atlantic, and Europe, largely living at peace with no dividing lines and so forth. So if you wish to ask me a question whether we all 57 are ready to go this way, I should say definitely yes, and Russia for the first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I fully agree with you that OSCE has been designed as a cooperative concept based on dialogue and based on trust and based on respecting of the rules which have been, or commitments and principles. But what we have now, we have a different perspective of how this concept can be interpreted. We have a different understanding whether these rules have been or have not been obliged, and we have, as you have heard, perception that the annexation has happened, that there is a growing military forward postures, and that we have a renationalization of policies. And in fact, the peace dividend is not seen as something to invest in, and people are rather preparing for further escalation as for further peace. And I fully take note of the Russia's contribution to creating a safe and peace Europe through the withdrawal of the post-Soviet troops from Central Asia, supporting the political processes here. But we have to also admit that the first conflicts of interest or perceptions started to appear with the addressing the conflicts which emerged in former Yugoslavia and also in former Soviet Union, where the perceptions started to differ. Some of these conflicts are present until today, and the different perceptions also remain. And I think that your message that this Cold War logic prevails should be taken note of, because I think this is one of the main reasons why we cannot find a common ground to have a good reconciliation of what actually has happened after the end of the Cold War. Is it what we have today, sort of continuity of somebody's victory in there, or talking about values and principles is a wrong approach, and we should rather come back to the idea of dividing of areas of interest or special zones, and of course the future of countries, as we have already mentioned, who have not been aligned or who have not become members of the Euro-Atlantic and European institutions also should be discussed. Let me remind you the conclusions of the panel of eminent persons report last year, who said that first we need to engage in diplomacy, and second we need to address the future political and security guarantees of the countries who are so-called in between. And this needs to be also addressed in a frank way, because we have, of course, different perceptions, but we don't have even an ability and readiness to discuss these issues. I would argue that today the question of the conflict in the east of Ukraine is also as a negative outcome of the lack of dialogue between Moscow and Kiev. Simply, we don't have a platform for discussion there, and the tools which the OSCE is using, including the SMM, have their constraints and limitations, how far we can contribute to that process. But without further discussing this, I would like to ask François Heisbourg to share his views. You have the freedom of being more in the academic side of it, so I'm very much looking forward to your provocative views on this. Please.
Well, thank you very much, an honored participant. It's a great pleasure to be in this very historic Chernin Palace. Chairman, you invited us earlier on to reflect on what went wrong. I will in part pick up on that suggestion, but maybe in a less judgmental way, because many of the things which are happening in terms of the European security order and disorder are not the effect of specific state or even human agency. Much of it is a consequence of very deep societal changes with impact on the international system. So what happened and what's next? What happened, and I list these more or less without particular order. One, of course, is the rise of revisionism. That is the notion that that a major power or a number of powers are unsatisfied with the existing security order and therefore seek actively to change it. This was formalized, for example, in a very complete and eloquent manner by Foreign Minister Lavrov's speech in Munich in 2016. This is a very, very clear expression of dissatisfaction. Secondly, we have the challenges of the unmaking and the remaking, and we don't yet know what the outcome will be, of the single most important intra-European security organization, and that is the European Union. I need not belabor issues about Brexit, about what now happen in the Eurozone and two-speed or multi-speed Europe and so on, but this will obviously have major impact as we go. Thirdly, we have, of course, greater multipolarity than was the case in the Cold War. This has already been noted. But it's not simply multipolarity, it is also atomization, fragmentation. The rise of non-state actors, not only as actors in their own right, on the scene positively or negatively, and of course on the most negative side, it's, for example, the advent of jihadi terrorism as an element of European insecurity in Europe as well as outside of Europe. But it's not only non-state actors in their own right, but also the interaction between the non-state actors and state actors. In some ways, we are moving back to the pre-Westphalian age. We're moving back to the 30 Years' War. We're moving back to the 17th and 16th century, where the state has in effect relinquished its monopoly on the legitimate use of force. What is state and what is non-state in ongoing episodes of information and cyber warfare, for example? When is a little green man a state actor or a non-state actor? Very difficult to parse these elements. And this is not a issue or region-specific development. It is a general and broad-based development, largely independent of what this or that state may make out of it. In terms of alliance systems, the Western alliance system has become transactional. It used to be unconditional. It has become transactional. The American president has been very clear about that. And of course, once you have made that clear, it's practically impossible to put the omelette back into the egg. What are the bottom lines of what has happened? Well, all of this leads to a more unstable system, a less manageable system, a more costly system, and one in which, by the way, security has become eminently divisible, not indivisible. At the extreme, it comes out as a world of what some analysts call a world of frenemies, where depending on what you're talking about and where you are, you will have your friend in place X is going to be your enemy in place Y. Your enemy at time 1 is going to be your friend at time 2. For an extreme example of that, you go to the current situation around Raqqa, the so-called capital of the so-called Islamic State, where NATO powers are at daggers drawn, where NATO and non-NATO powers are to some extent cooperating, whereas in other places, like in eastern Ukraine, they may not be cooperating. This is a very strange, very dangerous new world. So where do we go next with this? Well, first of all, the sort of non-state, jihadi, terrorist violence is not going to go away, even if tomorrow we liberate Raqqa. It is not going to go away either from the Middle East or from Europe, because of course Europe and the Middle East are not separated by the space of the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. The 30 years war into which the Middle East has entered will continue to spill over into Europe. It's going to get worse, not better. Look at the future of the Gulf, look at the future of some of the states of the Maghreb, to have some sense of what could be worse than exists today with the implosion of the Sykes-Picot world in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen. All very different cases, some with Western intervention, some with Russian intervention, some with nobody's intervention, but all with horrific outcomes. Multiply that by 2 or 3, and this is what it will look like in 10 years. Secondly, look for a return to violence, to the potential for violence in areas in which some of the trends I just mentioned meet. And here I'm thinking in particular of the Western Balkans. Anybody who walks around the region today, anybody who's been to Sarajevo recently, will recognize that you have an intersection between the rise of Salafi radicalization and the return of great power interference of pre-1914 type of games. When you have that sort of brew, anything can go wrong and anything is likely to go wrong. And if I were at the OSCE, I would ramp up whatever operations I still have running in the Western Balkans, and you still have operations running in the Western Balkans, and I would recommend that a lot more attention be paid to that region than we have been over the last 5, 6, or 7 years, because we had assumed that the era of the wars of Yugoslav succession of the 1990s, that era had been brought to a close. Unfortunately, that is too optimistic. Thirdly, in terms of what happens next, and this is the only good news item, sort of, and that is there continues to be a great power, element of convergence which also existed during the Cold War, and that is the convergence between the West and Russia on the threat of nuclear proliferation. The JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, has been a major achievement. In this world of frenemies, this was a very typical event where we were working between Russians, Chinese, Europeans, and Americans to solve an immense challenge to the global security order, while at the same time we were at daggers drawn in the South China Sea or in eastern Ukraine. This is the kind of world we live in. Security is highly divisible and will remain so for a long time. And anybody who expects that he can produce a coherent, positive outcome by simply saying, security has to be indivisible, that person is not living in the real world. That person is living in an academic world. And I use the word academic here in its negative sense. A serious practitioner has to assume that the world he or she will be living in will be a world of divided security. And by recognizing that security is divided, it will actually be possible to do a number of things together of great importance, JCPOA being one of them. And in conclusion, Chairman, OSCE in all of this. I already mentioned the Western Balkans. I do not have high expectations of returning to the spirit of CSCE of the 1970s and the 1980s. During that period, that was the period of the Sonnenfeld doctrine. The Soviet Union in Europe was a status quo power. It wanted to keep what it had. And the West, in its own way, had convinced itself, wrongly as it turned out, that there was no alternative to the status quo. And this made it possible to build up an organization like CSCE, which then became OSCE, which was built on the premise that the two blocks were there, but that you could work together despite the fact that there were two blocks. This, by the way, was our ancestors' way of recognizing that you could work positively despite the fact that security was, in practice, divided rather than indivisible. Of course, security was divided in the 1980s. It was even marked by a thing called the Iron Curtain. So no great hopes on that, but that does not mean that we cannot find areas to work together. And the last point, and this is an area in which we can work together, there are many things going on in the technological sphere. I'm thinking here in particular of information and cyber operations. We are only beginning to understand the implications of the potential opened up by the development of these technological areas. Unexpected things can happen. I'm not sure that the Americans and the Israelis were fully conscious of the consequences, for example, of launching Stuxnet against Iran. There were many reasons for launching it, and in its own way, it was quite effective because it probably made JCPOA possible by buying us 2 or 3 years during which we could negotiate with the Iranians. But it also created a whole new host of problems in terms of cyber hygiene in the rest of the world. And the same goes for Russian cyber operations. I think of Estonia 2005. We're only beginning to start to understand the implications of the new tools that we have in our hands. And we are like children who have stumbled across a box of matches. They've never seen this box of matches before. What do children do when they find matches? They start playing with them. And very nasty things can happen. So maybe we can talk about the matches. Maybe we can start the growing up process, codes of conduct, how to introduce or reintroduce the laws of proportionality in our conduct in these new areas of conflict at less than lethal levels. This is something I think which the OSCE, could dig its teeth into very profitably, and I know that things have been going on in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and for for giving us this reality check, I would say, while mentioning also this, I would say, outgoing powers revisionist view on Europe. And it's clear that in today's divided world, this big concert of powers apparently will not resolve the issues as it was in the past, and therefore we need to also take into account many other actors. And thank you for reminding us that the states don't have the monopoly on the using of legitimate use of the force anymore, that there are many other actors who use them illegitimately or sometimes even with the support of the states, but not with the stated support of that states. So the things are much more three-dimensional, I would say, and much more complicated to address. And thank you also for raising the challenges we have there, pointing to the situation in Western Balkans. And I can assure you that today we are dealing with these issues on daily basis. Just recently, Secretary General was visiting former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Ambassador Strohal here on behalf of the chairmanship was there too. So we are very much dealing with these issues, but we are having hope that now there is a new opportunity to address the issues of the elections and reconsolidation of there. But as you pointed out, there is a need to provide more attention to that region, and there are new elements, as not as a fallout of the Yugoslav wars, but also new elements like this radicalization and role of the non-state actors, and definitely that's an area where the OSCE has something to say. And I also like your premise that divisions will not disappear, that the divisions will remain, and maybe they will become even deeper, and it's more about how to create coalitions to address these divisions on ad hoc basis. You call it friends and enemies or frenemies. I would rather in the OSCE context call it looking for coalitions in addressing joint challenges. And this is where I think we are obliged to overcome divisions, and this is what we are trying to do. But when you ask me how much today the participating states are ready to invest in dealing with radicalization, in dealing with terrorism, in migration, I can tell you it's very minimal. It's very, very minimal. We don't have a budget in the OSCE today. The budget is falling down every year. Today it's below 139 million, and it may be even lower. So these divides prevent us to take common action, even though we realize how detrimental these challenges for the all European security they are. So somehow these relations, the East-West relations, prevail, and lack of the status quo prevail over common sense in addressing common challenges. But here I would like to ask Ambassador Hill to draw on his experience and also to use the freedom of being a professor at the academic institution, perhaps to provide us his perspective. Where are we standing now, what we can do, and where is the OSCE's role in the whole discourse? Please, Bill.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, many thanks for the invitation, the opportunity to come here, to my Czech hosts. Among other times, I recall very much being in this building on December 12th, 1989, and a time of perhaps unadulterated joy and unadulterated optimism at looking at a future that didn't always turn out the way we thought it was going to do. I am an academic, sort of now, but because of who pays my salary, I have to say that what I'm going to say are my individual views and do not reflect either the U.S. National War College, Department of Defense, or U.S. government. And as you hear what I'm going to say, that may become more obvious. I just finished, not long ago, a long study of European security institutions from the end of the Cold War to the present. I mean, I lived it, but I also studied them academically. And a couple of the conclusions that I came to in this lengthy work, first, is that I believe the post-Cold War Euro-Atlantic security order that we fashioned from 1989 to 1992 is over. It's dead. It's finished.
I mean, there were many good things about it, but the structures, some of the agreements have simply eroded or been vanished. One of the chief things that I see out of this is, indeed, it's been mentioned that Russia is a revisionist state. This has been emerging, if you read stuff that was being published in Moscow in 05, 06, 04, 05, 06, President Putin's speech at Munich in 2007 to the present day. And part of the reason for this is, I think, because of developments within the Euro-Atlantic structures. Structurally, we came from the optimism or the kind of looking for European security, a Europe whole and free from Vancouver to Vladivostok, that was praised in 89, 90, and beyond. We have what I call in my book a European security order that has no place for Russia. It's an institutional problem. Decisions were made along the way on the part of most of the parties, mostly, I find, out of the best of intentions, but the second order effects have led to something where an increasingly larger grouping on the one hand makes decisions which may affect others, but in which parties, in particular the largest state, Russia, have a voice but not a veto, which means, effectively, don't have a vote. There are other institutions that are challenged. In particular, I looked at the EU. Rising generation in the EU knows the problems of the current EU, but doesn't know the historical reasons as to why the institutions in the EU are the way they are. And therefore, there is a challenge to this crucial player in European security. And as François Heisbourg said, it's uncertain how it's going to come out. Many Western nations, including my own, especially post-Crimea, wonder just now what rules of the road that were agreed in Helsinki in 75, in Paris and Helsinki in 90 and 92, which rules of the road still are generally accepted, and which, or have they been overtly repudiated by others? In particular, beyond some of the questions of change of borders, is the question of just how much sovereignty are states in the OSCE area still willing to relinquish to external scrutiny of domestic affairs. This was a key part of the documents that were negotiated and adopted at the end of the 1980s, the early 90s, and it's just not clear exactly how much of this is still accepted beyond lip service. So I think that it's my opinion that we are either going to have to arrive consciously at a new mutually agreed security order in Europe, or we'll end up doing it unconsciously, step by step, and probably not in as peaceful or pleasant a fashion. I think activities like the OSCE structured dialogue, this is a good start to identify specific issues, specific problems, but I'm not sure that it's entirely sufficient. Eventually, I think somewhere, whether in existing institutions or in a new process, there is going to have to be a more comprehensive effort and forum. And here I'm not talking about a new Helsinki, taking the final act and renegotiating it, but a process like the one that you had from 73 to 75 in Helsinki and Geneva, where the baskets were all opened and any state could throw in proposals, and that the states together looked at these proposals and figured out which of them were acceptable, on which of them general agreement could be found, and which would be subject to further work, either abandoned or eventually agreed. Specifically, I think we need, among other things, first of all, a renewed US-Russia dialogue over nuclear matters, both arms control and non-proliferation. It is material and is relevant to all of the participating states in the OSCE area. In particular, I look at the INF regime, which is a product of the 1980s, and clearly with the proliferation of missiles and nuclear weapons, is outdated, but it would be a shame to lose it. So, at some point, I think something like this is going to have to be updated. Secondly, conventional arms. We really need to restore or recapture the transparency and confidence-building regimes of the VDOC and the CFE. I'm not sure that the type of arms control that we got in CFE, either in 1990 or 1999, is applicable or transferable anymore, but certainly the principles of restoring confidence and lessening the threat of surprise or the unexpected is something that we really need to get back. This is something that's been done in the OSCE, the context of the OSCE can be done again. We need new agreements on rules of the road, and here, just before me, Mr. Heisbourg referred to this. I mean, there are new technologies, new phenomena, cyber, social media, the use of the internet, where there are good ideas. Coming where I come from, I mean, we're particularly partial to the Tallinn Manual, but it's not universally accepted. And we need to examine the implications and find common ground on how we're going to deal with the pace of technological and social change in the OSCE area. And finally, an area that hasn't been mentioned, but I think it's worth looking at, Northeastern Europe. To me, this is one of the most dangerous areas on the planet now, because we're in the early stages of what could become a full-blown security dilemma. Given what has happened in Georgia and Ukraine, Western nations like mine have a legal treaty obligation to states in the area, to their defense. Yet at the same time, Russia has major strategic assets, St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad there, that, no matter what government, what system, any country would be worried about. And we need to find a way to cut short the suspicion and the need to respond, to defend, and to find some way to find a stable balance there and restoring confidence that because of the proximity of the parties involved and the proximity of the important strategic objects makes the area very dangerous. What to do? A new treaty. Well, I understand the reasons behind the Medvedev Security Treaty proposal. Personally, I found the text particularly clumsy, and this may have been one of the reasons that it did not get traction. I'm not sure a treaty, reviving a treaty or trying to find a new treaty is going to get any better response now than it did almost a decade ago. A dialogue in and between existing institutions. Well, certainly things like the NATO-Russia Council, EU dialogues with neighbors, and within the OSCE should be encouraged. But again, I'm not sure how far this is going to take us. And I think to the problems facing Europe today are not exactly like those that faced us when we wrote the existing documents. And we may have to take ourselves out of the institutional frameworks that we have now and find some way of including both the states in the Euro-Atlantic area and the institutions, including states, NATO, the EU, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the Security Treaty Cooperative Security Treaty Organization, all of these into a larger dialogue that examines these general, the new situation in European security and looks for renewed and new areas of agreement and new rules of the road. As I said, we can try to do this in an all-encompassing, planned fashion and negotiation, or otherwise we can let events do it for us in a piecemeal, unplanned, and often chaotic fashion.
Thank you, Ambassador Hill. And I'm afraid that today it looks that we are rather going with the latter perspective, as we don't see yet conscious effort really to address these differences with the view to create a cooperative environment. And thank you also to highlighting the need to go beyond structured dialogue, at least to start thinking about how we can benefit from all these inputs and views which are being discussed there. And I can reassure that the first meeting which we had in Vienna was very, very, I would say, substantive. And there was also a discussion between militaries about the military doctrines, and I think it was very helpful to better understand each other's perspective, also from the military point of view. So I think there is a lot of good, I would say, energy to really go into that direction. But I agree with you that we need to think about more. You are suggesting the creation of the new rules on the road. Perhaps this could be the way, but I hope that everybody agrees in this room that no, it's not about undermining the value and the role of the existing Helsinki Final Act principles. It's more about how to reflect their validity in the current environment, which is completely different from the one when Paris was signed, or even a Charter for European Security in Istanbul was signed. I mean, we are finding ourselves in completely different world, and it's about willingness to recognize it and go next step and use this basis for finding a new compromise. Whether it could be through the process as they have done in the early 70s, perhaps, but now we have these structures in place. We have delegations in Vienna, we have informal platforms, so I would rather argue for using what we have as opposed to creating new structures outside the OSCE context. Now I would like to open the floor. We have about 20-25 minutes. Who wants to start? Over there, our Turkish colleague, and then Mr. Halupetsky from the NATO Secretariat. Please.
Thank you. I'm the Turkish ambassador to the OSCE. Listening to the distinguished panelists, I was thinking, and we are in Prague, to what Jan Patočka said about taking care of the soul of Europe, and also thinking more deeply on the values, on the trajectory of what the European project represented. I think in today's challenges, to have a dialogue is not meaningful in itself, because the very concept of dialogue has changed. And that's why I think we need to take time when we are generating ideas which we are going to inject into real processes which are very much in the ownership of the participating states. So how to inject ideas? I think there is no prêt-à-penser. There is no we do not need fast thinking, as we are now living in a fast food culture, and I take this analogy of Pierre Bourdieu. I think we need to have a better understanding of what we have achieved, what these commitments and principles have meant, and we have to keep in mind that whatever we do, we need to do in very much respecting the no-harm principle. I think NATO, EU, the European project, regional organizations have not maybe lost their value. On the contrary, their value have even more increased, but we have maybe lost the political will to look into those institutions, and we are maybe part of the we have a part of in the responsibility in the erosion of institutions. So political will, taking time, not jumping into conclusions, very much respecting what we have achieved, but looking in a meaningful dialogue, which will very much taking the spirit of Patočka and the finality and justification debate. More thinking about the nomos, ethos, and also more being able to have the telos of what our institutions means. And then we might begin to slowly engage in a meaningful dialogue without predetermined outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and for your wise words. And I fully agree that we shouldn't rush. We have tried, as I mentioned, a couple of times, Corfu process, V2V dialogue, Helsinki +40. However, we were not being able to engage with the key policymakers into that discussion. In a way, there were parallel processes going on in Vienna and then going on between the capitals, which basically contributed to make the OSCE irrelevant from the perspective of the capitals. And I think what we need to do is now really how to make it more relevant and useful for this dialogue. And I really hope that the structured dialogue is a good platform for that. There are no predetermined expectations, no predetermined resolutions. However, we need to go towards some objectives, as we discussed, you know, the rules-based security in Europe, the implementation of commitments, future of the arms control, responding to the new global challenges, new technology. So I think there is a lot of on the agenda. It's only how to create an environment where we would have this meaningful dialogue with certain results. And unfortunately, we are not there yet. And I hope that we will get this support by all of you, and including through the security days. Mr. Chalupecký from the NATO, you asked for the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. And also thank you to all the panelists here. Fascinating interventions, some outright scary, I must say, but thank you very much for those. It's really thought-provoking to be able to react to you. I come from NATO. I'm the head of the multilateral section there in the political division, so I think I could chip into this debate, since NATO has been mentioned here a couple of times at least, since NATO has been a substantial player in Euro-Atlantic security, and I think NATO and will continue to be, despite what I think many people might think. First, on the lack of security, lack of trust in the European space that we, of course, feel at NATO extremely intensely, there is a lack of trust, but there's also a lack of transparency, including the military transparency. There's also a lack of respect of the fundamental values and principles of this organization, of the OSCE, as enshrined in documents that have been quoted here quite a couple of times this morning. That pertains to Helsinki Final Act, but also pertains to the Paris Charter, but also the Istanbul Charter, and a document as recent as the Astana 2010 Summit Declaration, or even the Hamburg Ministerial Declaration. The security in Europe also suffers from breaches of long-standing international agreements and outright breaches of international law. So before we call for new treaties here, before we call for new legally binding arrangements, I would actually think a little bit deeper on where we are on implementing the existing legally binding arrangements and the existing treaties, because there are no treaties that are legally binding and others that are really legally binding and others that are really, really legally binding. So we would probably start thinking there, and might lead us to other conclusions that we heard here this morning from some of the panelists. Now, I don't want to dive into an analysis of whether the lack of trust in Europe is a consequence of the lack of the other qualities that I mentioned before, or if it's the other way around. I'm pretty sure that we would not agree on that in this room this morning. But I think what we agree upon, and I've heard that multiple times, is how these should be tackled. And I've heard from everybody, more dialogue, more transparency. And I think NATO has been playing its part in this and will continue to play its part in this. About 6 days from now, the NATO leaders, the heads of states and government, including the new American and the new French president, will convene in Brussels to talk, to guide NATO through the next months, through the years ahead of us in this very complex security environment. I think there are some messages that you're probably going to hear next week. And one of the messages is going to be a message of unity, be it transactional, be it unconditional, but it's a real unity that will reflect what the NATO leaders are going to be, or that rather be reflected through the conversation of the leaders next week. You will hear a message of NATO being ready to defend and deter any security threat from any direction by any actor. To protect its members. And I thank Ambassador Erler, who mentioned just the enhanced forward presence of the NATO northeastern flank there as defensive and as proportionate and appropriate to the current circumstances. I thank him for that, because this is exactly how NATO sees that. You will hear that message. You will hear again a message of NATO's willingness to project stability beyond its borders, to fight new challenges like terrorism, like cyber defense, that has been mentioned here quite extensively too. But you will also hear NATO willing to lead a substantial and meaningful dialogue with partners. And when it comes to Euro-Atlantic security, the Russian Federation is the most prominent and most important partner of NATO to talk to. And we've been doing that. We've been doing that through NRC. We had some good, some less good NRCs. We will have more, maybe as early as next month. Not surprisingly, we're talking about the same topics as you talk about in the OSCE. It's about transparency, risk reduction, military transparency too. So we're certainly in sync with this organization on a lot of issues. Now, I must also add that NATO allies were the ones who came with multiple proposals last year during the German chairmanship on modernizing the OSCE toolbox, which we value very much and which we see as a tremendously important vehicle, and still valid vehicle actually, for strengthening security and stability in Europe. We will continue to do so. And you can always count on us being ready to discuss Vienna document, modernization of that document. You can count on us being ready to discuss moving forward on arms control, including conventional arms control, based on the principles that NATO has been very vocal about, and that is transparency, reciprocity, and host nation consent. And I think those are the principles that should be dear to the hearts of each and every OSCE member or participating state. Now, to conclude, let me just add a couple of sentences on the structured dialogue. It's a process that we value very much at NATO. It's the opinions on where this will lead us vary. Is it going to bring us a new European order, a new European security treaty? Most certainly not. Is it going to lead us to a new conventional arms control regime in Europe? The jury is out on that one. I think it's too premature to judge, but it can certainly provide us with another additional, very useful avenue for dialogue, for sitting down together and talking over our differences in the Euro-Atlantic area. And with that, I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We have one more opportunity for audience to take the floor, or two more, and then I will have to cut and give the gentleman opportunity to respond. But before that, I would like to thank you, Mr. Chalupetsky, to showing commitment to continue dialogue, to demonstrating that NATO wants to be a partner of Russia, to mentioning transparency as a key prerequisite for what we are doing here. We have heard from Mr. Krumm in the morning that it's also about the transparency of intentions. And I think this is one area where OSCE can play a role. So in order to address the misinterpretations, misunderstanding, as justification for strengthening the military posture. And this is what we are seeing here as well, but also addressing preemptively potential escalation, as we are trying to do to introduce the measures addressing the close military encounter. This is in the context of the situation in North Europe. So I'm sure that NATO will continue in that, and I only hope that those who are here will listen to this, and OSCE is a good platform for all sides to engage. Please, gentlemen over there, and then you will be the last one, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am First Secretary of Embassy of Ukraine here in Prague.
Switch on the mic.
Yes, it's clear. I am from Ukrainian Embassy here in Prague, and I have one question and one clarification.
Can you please speak up a bit more?
It's better? Yeah, clarification remark and question. My question is to Mr. Lukashevich. In your speech, you came back to the time when Soviet bloc was destroyed, and since then, according to you, you have a kind of agreement on the table, as I understand correctly, for global security in Europe, or even wider in Euro-Asian space. And this agreement, Russia is waiting because, as I understood, Western partners ignored such willing. If that is correct, my question is, which provisions you see in this agreement? What should be, because you mentioned legally obliged agreement, as I understand. Because for centuries, as everybody knows, Kremlin does not respect any agreement at all with neighbors on bilateral level or multilateral. And remark is, you mentioned crisis in Ukraine. There is no crisis. Just Russian-backed or Russian troops or Russian-backed forces invaded, occupied Crimea, and then we have third year ongoing war in the west, in the east. So let's call names, things as they are. It's a war, it's invasion, annexion. It looks like in Nazist time, Hitler could say, no, Austria was not annexed, just referendum, or Sudet region was not occupied, just German-speaking people came on vacations, with tanks, of course. That is, let's stop to misunderstand what is going on in eastern Ukraine. It's actually invasion, occupation, and infringement of international bilateral, multilateral legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like then give the floor to all members of the panel, but the last one is here. Mr. Ross, please go on.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. Gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to come to Prague for the OSCE Security Days. I'd also like to thank the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs for hosting this important colloquium. Gentlemen, it takes a little vision to see the needs of the future and to know the answers today. And that is why we are here. As the great English theologian and philosopher wrote long ago, things are seldom as they seem. To man who dimly sees, realities appear as dreams, and dreams realities. The OSCE has a mission which has become much more complicated in recent years due to the massive difference between dealing with crises on the level of eastern Ukraine and the Balkans, as examples. But I feel that we need to look at the facts as they are on the ground. Today, the OSCE, which is massively underfunded and definitely, urgently deserves more funding, needs to look at the problems. Open source intelligence has demonstrated from many, many sources which are independent that there are now over 700 new or vastly improved Russian weapon systems that are deployed in Crimea and in the Russian and Russian-supported forces occupied areas of the eastern Donbass. This is Europe. This is in Europe. We can leave here this afternoon and drive to this war. I would like to suggest that we need to open our eyes to the situation truly on the ground and decide that it is time, following from Minsk II and other international agreements, to remove weapons from the Donbass, to remove the weapons from Crimea, and return to the negotiating tables to discuss peace and fair and reasonable international trade. I feel we have little option other than that. Gentlemen, your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important note, and I fully agree with you that perhaps it would be difficult to talk about stable and prosper Europe without the peace in Ukraine. And here the organization, our organization, is trying our best to mobilize the environment conducive to moving forward in the peace discussions, peace negotiations. However, it needs everybody to play around, and this is where we have the challenges. And obviously this conflict is beyond Ukraine. This conflict also reflects the overall lack of trust in the all-European context, which we hope can be recreated if we move forward with the political solution of this conflict. Gentlemen, we have few minutes, so I would ask you maybe for 2-3 words from each of you to respond to your comments and also perhaps to answer some of the questions from the audience. Mr. Erler, please.
Two points from my side. First point is we have a lack of trust, that's right. But the question is that the lack of trust is a product of a long-standing process of alienation between the West and Russia, and that brings me back to the question of the diverging narratives. I very much hope that we are able to have a meaningful dialogue with our Russian colleagues about this. What I have heard from Ambassador Lukashevich about the constructive approaches of Russia in security questions in the last 2.5 decades, that was indeed also the impression from EU, for example. That was the background for the strategic partnership approaches from the EU. But the problem is that on the other side, on the Russian side, in the Russian elites, there was the impression that EU is counterproductive for any Russian interest, is using the weakness of Russia against Russia. And I think that is the road of this alienation process. And without addressing this problem, we will not solve the problem of the lack of trust. That is my most important point.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Alexander, would like to take the floor now.
Thank you, but frankly, I cannot do it in 2 minutes. I will do it in 1 minute. So, first, thank you very much for all these assertions, which are very discussable. From the NATO Secretariat, let me remind that this year, we are trying to celebrate, or not to forget, about the 20th anniversary of our founding act and 15th anniversary of the Rome Declaration. So you didn't mention it. It's very simple to frozen or close anything you created, and then trying to imagine in new things. The French colleague challenged the crux of the OSCE and the European security system, which is indivisibility of security. So perhaps for the academia, they can live with divisible security, but the crux of the OSCE concept is really indivisibility of security. That means nobody can strengthen its security at the expense of others. That's the point we try to accommodate with the imaginable treaty or so forth. I mean, trying to get rid of the past of the Cold War, to be very cooperative. And this is a good opportunity to cite Benita Ferrera-Waldner, for example, in 2000, when she exercised the function of the chairperson in office. It was a special session of the Permanent Council celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. Those were the words. It's of course a manifestation of our very great respect for the second term of chairmanship by Austria. Security through cooperation and a culture of dialogue. If relations between states on equal basis and equal terms are not to be an empty slogan, but a firm norm, they require a willingness to engage in cooperation instead of confrontation. What more can be said? And just a second on Ukraine, of course, I could have expected that somebody will stand in this audience and try to influence with these slogans of aggression, annexation, and so forth. I mean, we unfortunately got used to it in the Permanent Council in Vienna. There is a Minsk package of measures reinforced by the Security Council resolution, which should be implemented in full by parties to the conflict. Kiev, Donetsk, Lugansk. And there are guarantors of this: France, Germany, and Russia. So it is stipulated in the documents, not in imagination in your heads or your wishes. This is actually the disease of the OSCE, trying to agree on most norms and principles and then left unattended or unimplemented. So my additional plea, let's get back to the roots. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lukashevich, and thank you for mentioning this notion of indivisibility of security. I think this is one big area where we don't have a common understanding. We need to also discuss this perception from the side of Russia, from the side of the EU member states, but also from the side of those who are not members of these alliances, and also in accordance or in the light of the right to choose security arrangements, or freedom of choosing of security arrangement, but of course not against the support of the neighbors, but with the support of the neighbors. And I think this is one area where we still have a lot to discuss, as we know that the lack of trust between Russia and the close neighbors also contributes to this notion of instability in the European context. But that's what I hope the dialogue should be also about, this indivisible security or mutual dependence when it comes to maintaining security. Let me now turn to Mr. Heisbourg, please.
Thank you. I'll also speak for only 1 minute, Russian definition. 4 brief points. And they will actually be about the French case, since our friend from NATO reminded us that there was going to be the Brussels summit of NATO, and where we're going to have this, what should prove to be a quite extraordinary meeting between two very unlike individuals, Mr. Macron and Mr. Trump. First point, Mr. Macron came to power on the basis of an anti-populist revolt. He destroyed the party system, and he destroyed his populist challengers in one and the same breath. The perfect symmetry with the Trump accession to power. Symmetrical means equal but opposite, as you will all recognize. This is very interesting. This was not simply a replication of the status quo. This was a revolution against populism. It is the biggest transformation of our political system since General de Gaulle came back to power in 1958. And I'm not sure how this will play out, not only for us, but how it may play out in other countries in Europe. Second point, something very strange happened during our election campaign. Out of the 5 major contenders, 4 paid more than lip service to the 2% target of defense spending. Madame Le Pen, M. Macron, M. Hamon, M. Fillon. Now, why did they do this? I mean, none of them can be seen as being animated by the wish to please Mr. Trump. Why did they go for 2%? Because this is the cost of hedging. This is the extra cost you have to pay because you now fear, or in some cases, if you talk about Madame Le Pen, you desire the end of NATO. And therefore, you have to prepare for that risk which did not exist beforehand. When I said that this is going to be a security order which is going to be more costly than the previous one, that cost is also financial. Third point, we also witnessed a very interesting moment of decoupling in discourse during the French campaign between geopolitics, geopolitical interests, and political values in the European framework. There was one extraordinary moment when in one of his last rallies, then candidate Macron denounced in the same sentence Mr. Orban, Mr. Kwasniewski, and Mr. Putin. Very interesting. It's not usual to put Mr. Kwasniewski and Mr. Putin into the same basket, to use OSCE language. But he was doing exactly that. If this is to be taken seriously, and it certainly was taken seriously in Warsaw, because they noted that statement, that will also have implications. And then the last point, the visibility. Yes, there was a deliberate attempt to divide the French political establishment against itself by both President Putin and President Trump. They both made it very clear that they wanted to see Marine Le Pen win the election. This was more forcefully and more consistently done by President Putin than by President Trump. But certainly Mr. Trump's Twitter message on this particular issue was taken for what it was worth in Paris, and that is as a clear statement of intent by the American president. So when people talk about the indivisibility of security, come on, give me a break. You are the practitioners. You're supposed to be living in the real world.
Yeah, and exactly this is why we need this discussion, because we are using, perception of indivisibility which were there 25, 30 years ago, and we really need to put it into current context. And thank you for pointing or drawing our attention to what happened in France, and we are all looking forward how this will impact our overall European security. Ambassador Hill, please.
Thank you. I'm mindful, because I've been both, of how it's easier as an academic to say whatever you want in a book or an article, as opposed to a practitioner writing a communique or a proposal or a speech for a principal. But I would cast my analysis, or what I've said today, in terms of the old OSCE principle or practice, mutatis mutandis. The world has changed dramatically, and institutions must change with it. Keeping what is good, if one wishes, but nonetheless looking at what needs to change. I say this as a veteran of the Office of European Security in the State Department in 1990, 91, and 92, where we seriously debated whether there was a need for NATO with the end of the Cold War. We decided that there was, but we also undertook in the statements in both the London and Rome summits that NATO would change substantially. What I'm saying is that I see us at another such juncture today where it may well, and I actually believe that the institutions that we have today in Europe are eminently worth saving, but they are going to have to change, and they're going to have to change substantially in order to survive what's happening in society, technology, and other things. I think it's incumbent on those states or parties that most earnestly desire change, not simply to criticize the existing order, but to offer realistic proposals on what they would like to see in its place. But it's also incumbent upon those institutions and states that have been more satisfied with what exists to be open to entertaining change, because that is the most effective way of bringing about a peaceful alteration and keeping what it is that they like about what they have now.
Thanks. Well, so we are almost at the end of our fascinating discussion. I would like to thank our gentlemen for being frank, open. I noticed that the most frequent words used were change, divisions, lack of trust. At the same time, recognition of the need to cooperate, to maintain dialogue, to better understand each other. We all realize how critical the situation today is. At the same time, we realize we don't have to push ourselves into solutions. And clearly, we are finding ourselves in a new era, and it's about how to find responses to these challenges we are facing today. So if there is no OSCE, they will have to invent it anyway. So I hope that the OSCE provides a good platform for this discussion. And yes, we have hot conflicts, we have frozen conflicts, we have non-implementation of principles, but we have the OSCE, which provides certain structure. We have principles, we have acquis here, we have institutions. So from my perspective, I think it's worth of investing into this organization to keep us together and work together in addressing all these challenges. So let's give a hand to our panelists, and thank you very much for your contribution.